backdrop. Paul's been on a missionary journey for 4 years. He's back in Jerusalem. Now, he actually hasn't been in Jerusalem for really over 10 years, so it's been a long time. This is his hometown. But we learned from some of his writings that he was experiencing some anxiety from the trip. He was coming with goods, with some offerings that he had taken throughout the churches in Greece where he'd been traveling, planting churches. So he has an offering for the poor people in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a marginalized city. It was an occupied city. There was a lot of poor people there. And so people had given money to help support the poor. And so he's coming with this gift. He's also coming back to report to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, but he's fearful about it. Paul is a controversial guy. He's got enemies. And when he comes back into the region, he finds the extent of how great the enemies are. He's got people that really are aligned against him. They start these rumors against him that he's trying to pull people away from their Jewish culture and their Jewish roots, something that he never did. Paul was a Jew of Jews, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He maintained all the feasts and the festivals and all of the rituals. So he never did that. He was falsely accused. He was also falsely accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, something that you weren't allowed to do. And actually, there was a mob that gathered. So angry were they with him that the mob gathered and they beat him up, and they're about ready to beat him to death. And he's narrowly rescued by a Roman peacekeeping troop that occupied Jerusalem at the time, and they rescue Paul. They take him back to the barracks. The Roman leader, the commander of the barracks, he doesn't really know too much about Paul. He thinks he's an Egyptian rabble-rouser, so he thinks he's good. So his idea is, well, I'll beat him, I'll give him a lashing, and then I'll find out a little bit more about him. Paul says, hey, you can't do that. I'm a Roman citizen. Then all of a sudden, the commander's tone changes. He's much more conciliatory. And so what the commander does then to find out more about Paul is he calls an ad hoc meeting of the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish court. So they have this meeting. It's an unofficial meeting, but they're trying to figure out what to do with Paul. Paul sort of navigates it. We looked at this last week. He navigates it in a political way, kind of by throwing out this hand grenade of a concept about whether people are, the dead rise up, and if there's a resurrection. The people within the Sanhedrin, half of them were Pharisees, half were Sadducees. They didn't see eye to eye on that, and it sort of divided the group. And so Paul was able to escape. So this event that we're going to look at today happens the day after this Jewish court. Now, to kind of keep it in context, imagine in our own culture, there was a criminal that everybody really disliked, and they wanted some action taken. They brought him to court, but instead of the court actually coming to any decision, it was divided over sort of a political, cultural issue, and they never actually got to the case at hand. That would be the frustration that the Jews within Jerusalem were feeling about Paul. So in chapter 23 and verse 12, it says the next morning, so this is the morning after the court, that unofficial court that was supposed to determine who Paul was. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petitioned the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. So it's just sort of like right out of the script of a young boy's mystery novel or adventure novel. When I grew up, I grew up reading the Hardy Boys Adventures, and it's just got that sort of feel to it, this intrigue. There's this conspiracy that comes out, and you see 40 villainous, dark, evil men who took a vow to not eat or drink before they killed Paul, and something sort of warped and distorted, really admire. I mean, I got people that don't like me. There's a lot of people that don't like me. I have never had anybody, let alone 40 people, take a vow to neither eat nor drink until I'm dead. That's impressive. Something in me sort of greatly admires whatever it was in Paul that could evoke that kind of anger and outrage. I'm like, man, that's a guy I want to take after. So great is people's anger and frustration with him. These 40 guys, these dark, mysterious assassins have made this vow. Now, as we're going to read the story, it actually takes It takes 5 days for the case to even get to the governor, Felix. We're going to look at that here in a bit. It takes 5 days for that to even happen. We'll see that next week. And then it took 2 years for the plot to even resolve itself, and nothing really happened. So I have an idea these 40 guys either died at some point, or they more likely figured out a way to sort of finagle out of their vow-taking. Pharisees were super good at that. They could make vows, and then if something didn't happen, they had sort of an elaborate scheme on how they could get out of them. So, but it's just sort of it's just an interesting, intriguing thing that would come out of any sort of action novel or action film. So they take this vow against him. They want to kill him. And what they want to do is they want the Sanhedrin, that Jewish court. Now, in understanding the story, remember that Jerusalem is occupied by Roman forces. Now, they still have their own governance, but they are subjugated to Rome. So they're a province of Rome. So the Jewish court had some limited authority, but the Roman commander is deferring now to the Sanhedrin, this court. So what the conspirators are saying, they say, look, you reassemble the Sanhedrin, bring Paul back under the pretext of trying to find out more about what's going on, and while he's en route to the trial, we'll kill him. That's their plan. In verse 16, it says, but when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Now, we don't know anything about Paul's family, very little about Paul's family. We know he was a Jew. He was raised within the religious political sect called the Pharisees. He was also a Roman citizen, so his father had citizenship. We just don't really know much beyond that. But apparently he had a sister, and she had a son, and this nephew of his, who was, as we see in the story, was very likely a young guy, a young boy. He hears of this conspiracy, and he goes to tell Paul. Now, when you read through the historians and the commentators and some of those things, it is an interesting thing. People raise the question, well, how did the boy get in there in the first place? And if a young boy could just kind of walk into the barracks, why didn't the assassins that wanted to kill him just kind of come in? So immediately as the story begins to unfold, from a historical perspective, it raises some good questions, I think, that are interesting. And so now there's in that culture, Paul would have been, he's a free man, but he's a prisoner. He's under protective custody. So he's not able to sort of come and go as he pleases, but he's not technically a prisoner. So it would be consistent with historical data that families of prisoners would be responsible for their support. So maybe that's why the boy had access. Maybe the assassins just weren't very good. Maybe the assassins thought to themselves, hey, maybe instead of us taking kind of ridiculous vows, why don't one of us just pretend to be a relative of Paul and go kill him? Maybe they didn't think all that through. I don't really know, but it kind of begs these questions. And so as you'll see the story, there's a lot of these little questions in them. In verse 17, Paul called to one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. This raises another question. So Paul, after he hears the story from his nephew, he then tells the centurion, who would be part of the leader of the barracks. The centurion oversaw 100 troops. So he tells the centurion, hey, go tell the commander of the garrison that there's this conspiracy afoot. Now, the centurion is not beholden to Paul at all. So Paul has no authority over him. So why the centurion just sort of went and did it? That's another question that people kind of raise. Why did he do that? Maybe Paul had some kind of authority that he could sense in Paul. Maybe all of the events that happened in Jerusalem led that centurion to say, hey, there's something sort of special about this guy. I don't know. Maybe he was just a famous criminal. I have a friend of mine who was a correctional officer at Corcoran, where the state prison there in California, where Charles Manson is held. And I remember him telling me it's kind of a weird thing when you are overseeing Charles Manson. You'll see him in the yard or whatever he's doing. So maybe there was something about the notorious nature of Paul that made the centurion respond. But whatever the case, he goes to the commander and he tells them of this conspiracy to assassinate Paul. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner, sent me for you and asked me to bring this young man to you because he had something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand, so that's why you kind of get the sense he's a young boy. Took him by the hand and drew him aside and asked, what is it you want to tell me? So it's sort of like, come over here and tell me what's going on. He said, some Jews, the boy speaking here, some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, though, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request. The commander dismissed the young man with this warning, don't tell anyone you have reported this to me. So the boy tells the story, says, okay, good, I got it, now keep this on the down low. So it's a pretty cool story. Paul's under the protective custody of Rome. There's this conspiracy. The boy comes in, tells the centurion tells the commander then is going to take some action. That's pretty cool in and of itself. The story is just going to continue to build. In verse 23, it says, when he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken to Governor Felix. So he actually assembles a gigantic assortment of troops, an attaché to go with Paul to protect him on the way to Caesarea, which is about 40 miles north. So this is this is half the garrison. So half the soldiers that had been stationed there in Jerusalem, this is about half of them. So, and some people some of the historians have speculated that Luke is maybe embellishing the story a little bit because that would be way too many soldiers to accompany one guy. But this actually is consistent with Roman policy. Rome they were heavy-handed. They met force with force. So if there's one guy, you bring 10. If there's 10 guys, you bring 100. And if there's 40 guys, you bring 400. So this is consistent with how Rome would just sort of overwhelm the opposition. They had the troops, they had the force. They wanted this thing done. And now why this commander did this, it's hard to know. Maybe he saw Paul maybe he was afraid of Paul because Paul was a citizen. He tried to beat him, and maybe he wanted to kind of get this taken care of, kind of change the way people thought about him. Maybe he didn't want to get in trouble. Maybe it was out of his jurisdiction, and he thought maybe the governor needs to see this. Probably there was an aspect of it, this thing's a big pain in the rear, and I just want to get this guy out of the city because there's all this constant rioting and all the stuff that's creating it. I'm just going to kind of kick this problem down the can, this can down the lane. Whatever the case, this commander wants to get this taken care of and over with. So he sends Paul out with a huge troops, 200 foot soldiers, 200 spearmen, 70 cavalrymen. They all leave and they go to Caesarea to see Governor Felix. And he sends with him a letter explaining Paul's innocence. Here's what he says: to his excellent Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I learned he is a Roman citizen. Now, I kind of like this part of the story because it's just totally not true. And so what had happened, there's a ring of truth in it, but it didn't really happen that way. What had happened is Paul's getting beat up inside the temple. The Roman troops come and save him. Then they take him back to the garrison. They're about ready to beat him up some more until Paul says, whoa, I'm a Roman citizen. Now, when this guy's writing to his higher up, the governor there of the region in Caesarea, he's saying, I was benevolent. I heard that there was a Roman citizen under attack by a Jewish mob, and I rescued him. I'm a hero of the day, delivering one of the great Roman citizens from certain death. Not exactly what happened, but still the makings of a good story. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I've noted how he's sort of putting it all on them. I found that the accusations had to do with the questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I informed of the plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I'm doing due diligence. As soon as I heard, I sent him right to you, Governor Felix. I ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. Now, one of the questions that comes out of this historical narrative, remember, the Bible isn't just somebody kind of sitting down and writing down these stories. These are actual narratives that happen. So it's sort of be like us reading our newspaper or something like that, and you would want to see where was the source. How do we know that Luke had the letter? Of course, we don't have the letter. All we have is Luke's account of it. How would Luke know of it? Did he write about it? Did he see it? Did somebody tell him? There's a lot of scenarios that may have happened. Maybe Paul heard the letter read from one official to another, and he told Luke about it. Maybe Luke, Luke was a Gentile. He knew people. He was a doctor. Maybe he kind of poked around. He's a respected member of the community, and through some sleuthing, he found somebody who had a copy of the letter or knew. Whatever the case, he knew of this letter, and he wrote about it. And whether he actually had the letter in front of him or sort of wrote it from a perspective of somebody who would understand communication between officials, this is consistent with how officials of first century governance in Roman governance would communicate one to another. So he's telling the story of how he's giving the narrative of what he understands the letter to be. In verse 31, so the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris, which would be about halfway. The next, so that all of the retinue go about halfway, then all the foot soldiers go back, and the cavalry continues on. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, which had been up north, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here, and ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So the fact that Governor Felix is seeing it was good for the Jewish people that were bringing the accusation. It means they didn't have to go way up north. They could take care of this in a more local area. One of the things we'll see next week, is that the actual by the time the high priest actually takes the case to Governor Felix, it's 5 days. So those guys are getting a little hungry and thirsty before it even really gets kind of the ball rolling. But it'll be another 2 years for this thing is resolved. So they all either died or got really honked off. Now, this is one of those stories that's kind of easy just to look through and kind of pass over. But I really, let's stop for just a second. Sometimes you have to take your Bible glasses off and just see if we can really understand the context of what's happening here. Try to imagine yourself in Paul's situation. Now, none of us are going to probably achieve that sort of worldwide notoriety, and certainly Paul, throughout the history of the ages, is just a great, great man. But just imagine yourself in a hostile environment. When I think through this, I think of something like a Middle Eastern country, a war-torn country. So you're in a war-torn, occupied city that's hostile to you. So there's places where we as Westerners, we shouldn't be traveling. So think of that place. It's a place we shouldn't be. People are going to be hostile to you. And you've been met with some mob violence, but you've been sort of saved out of that mob violence by an even worse occupying force. Rome was brutal. If they thought you were an enemy of Rome, they would kill you in the most creative and atrocious way to ensure that nobody else would ever do what they thought you might have done. So this was not sort of being, oh, good, I'm in the Roman barracks, I'm so safe and so happy and so warm. It's not that at all. It'd be more like being in the barracks of ISIS or something like that. These were violent, hard people. In fact, it was Emperor Nero that eventually executed Paul, most likely. So this was not a place where Paul is feeling all cuddly and warm and protected. He actually sort of got saved out of one violent situation into potentially an even more violent situation. So this is a dangerous place. So think about that for a second. You are in a dangerous city, a hostile city that's occupied by an even more hostile force, and you've been saved from a mob only to be sort of thrown into the protective custody of a dangerous group of people. Okay, you got that picture in your mind? The whole story would be laden with anxiety. It would be fearful. It would be terrifying. And then all of a sudden, when you're sort of brooding and wondering and concerned and worried about what's going to happen, your nephew runs in, who you've probably never even met. He just sort of comes in all of a sudden. You're like, what? And there's this kid who's got this story, this unbelievable story of 40 villainous assassins who are, it's like out of a Disney movie. I mean, they're like singing songs and they're polishing their blades and they're getting all ready to go kill the hated criminal. And it has all of the intrigue of this unbelievable story. The boy comes in, he tells you the story, you're like, okay, hi, how are you? Good. How's mom? You know, and he tells you this story, and then you tell the centurion. The centurion tells the commander. The commander is, you know, so there's all the intrigue of the commander who just a few days ago was beating you, wanting to beat you, and now all of a sudden he's like, I think I shall save Paul. I think I shall call a massive troops to escort him safely to Governor Felix. Well, he will certainly be tried and heard under the order of law. And so you see this whole narrative kind of develop. And then I always think of it from the perspective of the little boy. Kind of when we were kids, maybe some of you guys can relate to this. You think of these adventure stories from the perspective of your youth. Anybody kind of done that? And develop these elaborate scenarios of what would happen if, when I was a kid at church, mostly because church bored me, I would have these elaborate scenarios of what would happen if a villain came into the church and began to gun my friends and family down. What would I do? And I began to think, well, the only thing I have on me that could be used as a weapon, I had those big church shoes that your parents made you wear, you know, when they had big old, I thought, well, I could take these big old church shoes and I could whack the guy on the head and I could save my family and I'd be the hero of the day. So even the story, even from a child's perspective, has all of the excitement and the intrigue of just a novel that's just too much. It's the story is too great. You never believe it. You never believe what happened. But do you know that every story of deliverance has that same kind of ring to it? Every story of freedom has that same kind of ring to it. You're never going to believe what happened. Part of the challenges of my life as I've grown throughout my years as a pastor and a human on planet Earth, and my story of salvation and how I grew in the Spirit and all those things, is one of the struggles of my life was disbelief, faithlessness. Some of you struggle with faithlessness too. Faithlessness is part of the human condition. It just is. Part of the veil that we have over us is that we don't always see reality the way it should be seen. So we struggle with faithlessness. And your faith is only going to be as great as your next step, the next step into the unknown. Part of the reason we struggle with faithlessness is we never step into the unknown. If we never step into the things that stretch our faith, our faith will never be stretched. So this was my journey, and even though I'd been healed, I'd had deliverance, God restored a life from homelessness to just unbelievable blessings, blessing after blessing after blessing, stuff we've gone through with our family, I could go on and on and on and on. And in each one of those, I always sort of had this mixture of faithlessness, but then saying, God, build my faith, build my faith, build my faith through these things. Now I'm kind of at a place where the stories are too much. They're too incredible. And sometimes I'll sit down with people, and if you tell them to people who are people of faith and have experienced similar kinds of things, they're like, yep, yeah, those things happen in my life too. And sometimes when you talk to them with people who don't have faith, they're sort of looking at you like you're a little crazy, and you sort of start the story off with, you ain't gonna believe it, but here's what happened. And whether they believe or whether they don't, that's on them. I can't let my faithlessness keep me from talking about how good God has been to me. But if you're going to walk in those areas, if you're going to be on that edge where the divine power of God meets people that need the divine power of God, it means you're stretching the boundaries of your faith and your culture and your community, and you're dealing with people that maybe see life in the world and things differently than you, doesn't it? It's kind of dirty. It's kind of one of the big problems. The reason we have so much faithlessness in the church, the reason that we have so many challenges in the church so often, is that in the evangelical church community, nobody is ever challenged to step beyond their faith. In fact, what we tend to do is we tend to sort of bring everybody kind of into a common place. Do you know why people tend to leave churches? It's because they heard something they didn't like. Pastor said something they didn't like. So in other words, if the pastor said something about culture, about faith, about politics, about society, something they didn't like, instead of kind of reflecting, say, well, hey, maybe I should learn something here that might stretch and expand the way I think, they just go, that guy's a commie, I'm out. It happens all the time. One of the great joys of my life is honking Christians off. I really like doing it. Because if we are going to actually live a place where our faith actually takes root and takes action and requires God, we have to live well outside the boundaries of sort of established church. We got to get past saying, well, I want to come and hear a message that makes me feel good and sort of confirms all of my politics and all of my sociological issues and all the things that I believe about life, comforts me, and then sort of gives me some platitudes about how great my life is and how awesome things are going to be. If I give God $100, he's going to give me $1,000. I'm going to marry the pretty girl. I'm going to be skinny and handsome and have lots of cars in my garage. And we have to get past that. That's not the journey of faith. The journey of faith is gritty. It's dirty. It's when the gospel meets people that need it. It brings healing. It brings restoration. It brings forgiveness. It brings liberation. And at the same time, it's doing war with really dark things, hard men, hard women, spirits that are lined up against me. If you don't have some blood on your knuckles, you're not living the kingdom. You're just not. You're just not. And the reason we struggle with faithlessness is because we've all sort of camped in our little camps, and we hear the things we like to hear. We hear the things that affirm all the things we already believe, and it never requires us to stretch our faith at all. So we have very little of it. When's the last time you told a story to somebody that didn't believe in Jesus that began like this? You ain't gonna believe it, but this is what happened. You ain't gonna believe it, but God healed my body. You ain't gonna believe it, but God set the captive free. You ain't gonna believe it, but I am free from things that held me in bondage for years. When's the last time you told that story? If you haven't told that story, if your knuckles aren't bloody, if your face isn't bruised, you're not in the kingdom. Because that's where the kingdom happens. That's where faith happens. That's where the gospel of Jesus happens. That's what the church is supposed to be. He's not building a country club. He's building a war machine. Crosspoint Church is always going to be beyond the pale of comfortable Christianity. It's not for everybody. We know that. It's always going to press the boundaries of comfortable cultural Christianity, because that's where I want to live. I want the band to come up. Crosspoint Church will be a place where the hurting will be rescued. It's a place where those who are captives will be set free. It's what Jesus said he came to do. He said, I didn't come here to tell you the things you want to hear. I came to preach the gospel to the oppressed, to set the captive free, to heal, to bind up the brokenhearted. Every single one of those stories begins with, you ain't going to believe this. It's why Paul said, I walk by faith. I don't walk by sight. If you can see everything that God has done in your life with your natural eyes, you haven't even scratched the surface. You haven't even scratched the surface. Your life and my life should be filled with stories that begin with, you ain't gonna believe this. Because when God brings healing, when Jesus brings healing and deliverance and sets the captives free, that is an unbelievable story. That's something that we will never be able to explain in the natural. Can only be explained in the power of Jesus Christ.